Max, what's your reaction to Russell Wilson's comments there?
It reminds me of Michael Jordan's statement in the sense that a responsible person can't find fault with anything he said. And I think he spoke responsibly about this issue. I mean, we're saying everyone, this is not just about making statements, essentially, is what he's saying. It's that everyone needs to care about each other. And obviously, Black Lives Matter, although the point, and then he goes on to say all lives matter, you know, police lives matter too, all lives matter. The point of the Black Lives Matter movement, the reason it says not, parenthetically, it's two. Black lives matter too. In other words, it hasn't always been so obvious to everyone that black lives do matter. Black life has been cheap throughout the history of most of the history of this country and continues to be so in many places. And that's the idea of bringing attention through Black Lives Matter. But you can understand why reasonable people don't get that at first. And they say, wait, all lives matter, of course. And so when he says, obviously Black Lives Matter, that kind of speaks to the heart of the idea. No, it's not always so obvious. You can't really find fault with what he's saying. It sounded sincere. He was asked a question about it, obviously. It's not like he just proffered this opinion based, you know, out of the thin air. And yet there is something about it that feels as though no one could possibly be offended by anything in it. And that goes hand in hand with how Russell Wilson is perceived, that he's trying to stay out of it. And by the way, let me just say, that's also his prerogative. I don't hold that against him. I think people who, and I am one of those people who often make a big deal about more people need to use their voices, use the platforms they have. It should also be said that in this era, the social media era, it's much less risky to make those statements. It doesn't take as much courage as it once did. And if the assumption is that everyone needs to be speaking out, then how much credit do you actually give people who do it? In other words, I'm not going to hold it against Russell Wilson that he is a bit milquetoast about this.
Right. I agree with Max in the sense it goes along with who Russell Wilson is. Russell Wilson is everybody's All-American. He's a guy who does a lot of community work. And when he does that community work, you can believe there's going to be a picture of it. I played with a guy in Troy Polamalu who did a ton of things. And there was never a picture because it was always about, let me just go give. Let me just go give back. Russell has done a great job with the perception of himself and with what people see as his brand. And I think that answer goes along with it. I also agree, you can't argue it. He mentioned that black lives do matter. He mentioned that police lives do matter, that all lives matter. And if you're a sensible person, if you're a person that understands life and how precious it is, you agree with that. I did something with Jason Reed for Undefeated, and I just spoke about the plight of the black man right now. And when he says, obviously they matter, throughout history, we've shown that they really don't. And recently, we're even being shown even more because what we're seeing now on video has been going on for ages. We just have phones to capture it now. And if you're looking at Russell Wilson, I look at the NFL and I compare it to the WNBA, where the money isn't as big, where people aren't focused on as much as quarterbacks or NFL players. But if you look at the pictures you saw from the WNBA, it didn't matter what color the player was. They all supported that Black Lives Matter. And I think you have to be so image conscious as a quarterback in the NFL, also as a black quarterback, when you don't have these other guys out supporting, when Aaron Rodgers doesn't step up and say something about it, when Tom Brady doesn't step up and say something about it. Now the Russell Wilson and these guys feel like, okay, do I go out on this limb and say that? And when you say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that all lives don't. It's the lives, and those are the lives that are under siege right now. And if Russell Wilson comes out, and I want him to say it, I want him to say, yes, black lives do matter, and here is why. And when you look at, if you went to a cancer fundraiser and people had on breast cancer shirts, you wouldn't expect somebody to run in and say, hey, diabetes matters too, and it's a killer. Because we know that. But right now, we're focusing on this thing. We're focusing on the lives that cancer is taking. So right now, we're focusing on the black lives that are taken because those are the lives that are being taken and no justice is being done. So for me, and it's not just, and I'm not a person that can say, hey, Russell, you have to say something. But for me, given that opportunity, I want him to take a stand and be a part of a movement because Michael Bennett, nobody hears him. Unfortunately, we talk about it, but the guy at Starbucks in Seattle is not sitting around saying, you know what, Michael Bennett said something about Black Lives Matter, and it really resonated with me because he's not. If Russell Wilson says it, you better believe at Starbucks, when he's getting his latte and they call his name and they say, Michael, come get your cup, he might be sitting next to a guy and say, hey, man, did you hear what Russell Wilson said? And so those are the differences in what he said and what he could have said.
Point.
Very good points. But let's get down to this. First of all, we all know that Russell Wilson doesn't have to say anything. Mm-hmm. It's his choice. He can do what he wants to do. We also know that a lot of times athletes are being asked to do things they're ill-equipped to handle, meaning speak out about issues. You're either not knowledgeable about it or you're not comfortable speaking about it out of fear. And the fear might be something as simple as you don't have the confidence in yourself that you can articulate yourself in a manner that everyone will get exactly what you're trying to say. But I think the thing that goes widely unrecognized, Ryan, Max, Molly, that hasn't been said enough, and I'm going to bring attention to this now, is that when you are a guy like Russell Wilson and you see people, particularly from the black community, that are looking at somebody like him, they're asking for a couple of things. They're asking for you to be fearless to some degree, because that's really one of the battle cries. You've got millions. You're making this money. You're a star. You're set. If you're scared when you are set, what kind of heart do you have? Really, that's how people are looking at you. But they're also looking at you from the standpoint that when you do speak about the issue, are you sensitive to the battle that is there? One of the things that I remember, I never forget, my dad once explained this to me, and I've always used this story on many occasions. He said in the 1960s, I was born in 1967, he said while we were in the throes of the civil rights movement, he said Martin Luther King was about peace. He was about nonviolence. He was about all of these things, just civil and equal rights for all, okay? He was hit with police batons. He was hosed down. He was beat up. He was incarcerated. He had dogs sicked on him. And essentially, there was a segment of our populace that gave him the figurative, if not literal, middle finger and said, go screw yourself. We don't care what you want. And then Malcolm X came along. And he said, by any means necessary. An eye for an eye, et cetera, et cetera. And then you know what that same populace did? They said, why can't you be more like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? And as a result, all of a sudden, the person that they started listening to, who had been preaching nonviolence from day one, suddenly you wanted to hear him because the alternative was far worse. And you have a segment of our populace in this day and age, right or wrong, and we all know to inflict violence upon anybody is wrong, especially law enforcement officials. But when you're thinking about what the plight is from a certain segment of our population, which in this case we're talking about the black community, obviously you have people with that mentality like that out there by any means necessary to stop what is happening to us. And when you look at people who are from our community, who look like us, who have the same pigmentation, hue, culture, environment, etc., but they've made it. They've made it. And they no longer have to worry about paying their bills. They don't no longer have to really worry about getting pulled over. And not to say that that doesn't happen, because it does happen on occasion. But the point is, they don't have to worry about it the way the quote-unquote common Joe or somebody else has to worry about it. And you don't speak out. You are considered an individual who has forgotten where you came from. And when you are a person in a pristine and elite position, trust me when I tell you, speak to me if I'm wrong here, that is the last thing that you want. You do not want to be perceived as someone who has forgotten where you came from, because that's when you are all by yourself.
I love your dad's point, because in other words, these grievances have to be addressed and redressed, right? That has to happen. So we can do it this way. Oh, you don't want to pay it, or we could do it that way. Oh, you like this way better, right? So, in other words, whatever you say, you got to say something. You got. I mean, I like that. And to your point about justice, social justice in the Black Lives Matter movement, part of it is actually what's happening, and part of it is the response to it. The fact is, there's almost never police wrongdoing in terms of, when it goes through the justice system, something is broken, because even though, yes, you have to wait for the facts to come out and judge each case individually, it's not all cut and dried, but certainly it's more than whatever it is, 8 convictions out of thousands.
But keep this in mind. We bloviate about how the NFL is a multi-billion-dollar establishment. They're number one. They're king. And so when you are a star in the NFL, particularly when star white players have nothing to say, because that wasn't what the case was during the civil rights movement. You had white folks out there standing up on behalf of black people and the transgressions and the incendiary things and the insidious things that were happening to us. When you have guys today who are quiet, who come from the white community, that puts even more pressure on black stars to speak up.
That's
because
why I
they're saying,
agree
wait a
with
minute,
Richard
you got to say something.
Richard Sherman last week, I disagree with Richard Sherman last week when he said, look, white players, should they speak up? They should, but I think if you're a white player in the NFL, these are your colleagues, your friends, even your opponents. These are people you work with, you live with, you play with. You have a responsibility to first sensitize yourself to the issue, educate yourself, and then absolutely show solidarity.
I think the other part that we've missed here is the perception of Black Lives Matter. You put it eloquently when you said it means Black Lives Matter too. The perception has been, if you support that, then you don't support that police lives matter, and you don't support that all lives matter.
That's totally wrong.
But that's totally wrong. So since that is the perception out there, even to a guy like Russell Wilson, who may not understand that, you feel like getting on that side of Black Lives Matter means that you oppose the other side. And I can be honest, I have an interesting view of this, because one of the policemen that was shot in Baton Rouge went to my church. So we had the memorial. We had the funeral there. As soon as those policemen were shot on Tuesday, we had 12 churches come together of all different colors, all different races, in fellowship. But the one thing that was missing, even in that situation, Black lives have been getting taken for years.
Yeah.
And there's been an epidemic on them lately, in a run of unjustly things and justice system not coming to their aid. And before the policemen were killed, we didn't have the vigils, or we didn't have the memorials. So what we have to do, you're right, when Richard Sherman's statement is wrong, because once you get the Max Kellermans, once you get the Aaron Rodgers, once you get the Tom Brady's to come along, it gives a different voice. Now it's not about people complaining because they were wrong. It's about people standing up because people were wronged, and it's continuing to happen.
That's what the civil rights movement was all about, actually. Yeah.
And I think strong take also, again, you're saying that this isn't anything new. We also just have the visual now with the phones too. And a guy like Russell Wilson will have more impact. Thank you so much. Always a strong take from you. When we come back here, the sun's coming out in Florham Park. It's beautiful. First Take on the road.